Hello everyone and welcome to a new session with me, Miss Strategy. I have been waiting for this lady, Sopiko, to finish her banter blitz. I hope that you challenged her and I hope that you had fun playing against Miss Tactics. She's a very strong player, a very aggressive fighter. So it's not easy to face her. I already played her 2 times. We played 2 draws. So I'm lucky that I survived those games, that it's not an easy challenge. I know that she's a really tough opponent, but you can learn a lot from... I'm listening to myself. Sorry about that. So you can learn a lot from those games versus Miss Tactics, and also her tactics shows are excellent. Now what I will focus on is the usual stuff, the middle game and positional play. I don't know if you remember our last real session, because last week it was the birthday of Chess24 and we celebrated it with a handicap banter blitz joined by Sopiko via Skype. So we were facing all sorts of crazy challenges. You can find the video on YouTube. And before that session, we studied about let's see if somebody remembers in the chat, in the live chat now on Chess24. Meanwhile, I will bring up the board and help you a bit about the topic. We saw 2 games. The first one was actually not this one. Let me go to the first one. It was a Kasparov PK game. And the topic was, oh, look at that square. The d5 square, the d5 outpost for the knight. So basically, our topic from February and also continuing now into March is about good knights. Yeah, good knights. So the d5 square is a great outpost. Whenever you see a pawn structure like this, it often happens in the Sicilian after c5, and later on if black pushes e5. For instance, in the Najdorf variation, you have a square on d5 that could be used for a knight. Of course, it doesn't mean that the Najdorf is bad. It's a really good opening, and once again, you can learn a lot from Sopiko from her video series on the Najdorf. I'm just saying that pawn structure, for instance, could potentially turn into a position where you have a very strong monster knight on d5. So this was our previous middle game session about the knight on d5 and how you actually get there. Remember that we always wanted it to be supported, so Kasparov was not in a rush placing the knight there. He played a couple of moves before that, then he eventually jumped onto d5. And the important thing about these games, Kasparov's game and the other game that we checked the previous session, something wrong with my pronunciation today. So the session was about this knight on d5, and that you always want to take back with a piece. Remember that if you have an outpost, so an outpost here, the d5 square, a hole in the opponent's pawn structure, you always want to take back with a piece. Whether it's a knight, that's the best if you can replace your knight with another knight, or with a rook if you don't have another knight, a queen, a bishop, anything but not a pawn, because the pawn capture, unless it wins material or it helps you in opening a diagonal you badly need, don't take back with the pawn, because you completely change the pawn structure. There's no weak square on d5 anymore, no outpost for you anymore. And you see also that it's not only about the square, but also the d6 pawn, which is a backward pawn. It's a weakness. I want to put it red, not green. That's a weakness. So the d5 square is an outpost and the d6 pawn is a backward weak pawn in these structures. This was one of the games we saw, and another one was Vishwanathan Anand's game versus Valverde. The funny thing about today is that we will still learn about the good knight, not on the d5 square, but on the f5 square. And I thought it would be really cool to choose 2 games by the same players. So, once again, we have 2 model games, one by Garry Kasparov and the other one by Vishy Anand, 2 former world champions, really strong players, legendary chess players. I love their games, so I like to pick their games, and of course I have other favorite chess players too. But for the fun part, I thought that let's study 2 more games with the same names, same players, now in a different square, placing a very strong knight. So the first game will be by Kasparov. This is another simul game, I believe. That's when he faced several lower rated players, so it's not about how strong his opponent is. I'm not picking these games because these are his best games. No, he wins relatively easily these games, but it's also very instructive. So I like simul games for the purpose of demonstrating an idea, because these ideas are very clearly seen in games where a very strong player faces a much lower rated player. So you'll see here that, of course, typical Kasparov game, he's pushing the h pawn, the g pawn, he wants to attack the king on g8, and you don't see any knight on f5 yet. But we will get there, we will get there. So from a position where he's attacking the opponent's king, he closes the center. Of course, with the king on e1, you don't open the center. You close the center because you are attacking on a flank. This session is about good knights, but I also want to explain a bit the rest of the middle game. So once you start an attack against the opponent's king on one flank, first of all, I know this is obvious, but you don't normally castle on that flank. You don't want to castle kingside when this is the flank. You are launching your pawns towards the opponent's king. So, of course, he wants to castle queenside, but he's not in a rush. And he's not in a rush because the center is closed. So as long as you keep the center closed, actually the king is fine on e1. Let's get rid of the red color. It's not a bad king. You can castle queenside anytime if you need to. This was captured, takes back with the c pawn. Of course, he wants to maintain this funny V shape. And after bishop d7, knight g3, knight c7, bishop g5, f6, he came back, so he basically provoked f6, and all this is happening in order to attack on the king side, but it needs some preparation. So you see that we want to attack on the king side, and the opponent, since the center is closed, all he has left is to try to counterattack on the other flank. So when there's a flank attack, normally you have two options: to attack on the other flank or to counterattack in the center. But since here the center is closed, black should, of course, attack on the queen side. That's what he's doing by pushing b5, threatening b4, and Kasparov prevents it by playing a3. After a5, bishop d3, he's also developing his pieces. Of course, you cannot give mate without having most of your pieces in the game, if not all your pieces. I prefer that you develop all your pieces and then you give a mating attack. That's the order for me. So have as many attacking pieces as possible, as many active pieces as possible. And we are getting to the point here after g5. This is you could say that this is a mistake, g5, because it weakens the f5 square and this knight can clearly jump to f5. Not at the moment, we will explain why. So you might think that g5 is a completely silly move, and if black did not play that move, he would have been fine. This position is actually really difficult for black already. For instance, the very natural b4 is not a good move. I mean, yes, you can play it, but you don't achieve anything. How would you react to this move, b4? This is something that Miss Tactics could show you, but I want you to calculate if a takes b4 is a good move or a bad move. Be creative. After a takes b4, is that position good for black or for white? That's the first question of today. Let's give some time to think. Alright, this was actually quite a difficult warm-up. This will be the most difficult question I have asked you during the whole show, so excuse me for that, but I wanted you to think about it. I did not expect anybody to solve this because it's really difficult to calculate everything after a takes b4, a takes b4, and if it's good or not. But I always want you to think so that when I explain the variation, I think you will learn a lot more than if you did not try. So I don't like telling you always the good moves and then you can just sit and maybe you remember, maybe not. But if you try, and even if you fail finding the solution, at least you tried and you know the position to some extent. That's why I always make you think about the position. So don't worry if you did not get the right moves. The idea is this: a takes b4 is a bad move as white, because after a takes b4, rook takes a8, b takes c3 is a horribly strong intermediate move. So black's queen is hanging, he could take on a8, which is of course not a bad move, but b takes c3 is a lot stronger. The white queen is hanging as well, and it's hanging with a check. So yes, it's possible to take this, but since this is a check, we will take the rook now. And if you count what happened, it's a piece up for black. Don't worry if you did not see it. As I said, I want you to learn from this, so always pay attention to intermediate moves after a takes b4, a takes b4. The knight is hanging and the rook is hanging. So obviously you calculate rook takes a8, but b takes c3 wins a piece. Careful about these motives, even in such a dominant position as this position with white. You should be careful. You should always be careful. So instead of a takes b4, which would be a horrible mistake, you can simply move the knight away and black has nothing. His problem is that, yes, let's say he could take here, try to bring some pieces, exchange this bishop for white's bishop, but even if, for instance, white closes the king side with the move h6, now suddenly what we will see is not that white wants to give mate on the h file, but he closes it down on purpose just in order to play against this bishop. And yes, that's not a knight, but it's a very bad bishop. So we are talking about good knights and bad bishops at the same time. This bishop on h8 is the worst piece on the board. It could hardly be worse than what it is already in the corner without any mobility. And that's the perspective for this bishop. Even if at some point you push f5, perhaps you will get mated because this will be captured. And secondly, it doesn't help much. It doesn't help much because you're opening the position in front of your king just in order to make a move possible for this really bad, really sad piece in the corner. So this is bad. This is really bad. And the way to play these positions is that you see that now the b and the c file are open. So you might say, yes, black has a bad bishop, but what about white's king? You can't really castle queenside in this position, not only because this pawn is hanging, but also because of the open files. So even if the pawn was not hanging, this is a suicide. Don't do that. Don't castle where open files are already available for the opponent or he's about to open those files. Don't do that. But there's a very safe square for our king, and that is simply the f2 square. Sometimes it happens, you don't castle, you don't need to castle in this position because, as I said, the center is closed. So this can only happen when the center is closed, that your king on e2, for instance, or on f2 can be safe. You will bring the rooks to c1 and b1 as it's drawn, you can push a4, and you will play on the queen side. So as surprising as it may sound, white will eventually end up winning the game on the queen side because this is actually a winning advantage for white. No material advantage, but it just feels like white is a piece up because of that horrible bishop in the corner. So that's why he can win the game on the queen side. He can bring all his pieces to the queen side, and black is struggling with a lack of space and a horrible, horrible bishop on h8. So this is what would have happened if black plays in a normal way. Instead, he pushed g5. He wanted his king safe, but it doesn't really help. Question is, shall we jump to f5 right now with our knight, since this square is weak, available for the knight, or do you have a different plan of exploiting this weak square in the opponent's camp? I'll give you some time to think about this. Some great ideas there in the chat on Chess24. You guys are great. So most of you have suggested that it's not a really good idea to jump to f5 right now, and I agree. If we play knight f5 at the moment, it's not a strong move. We want to exploit this square, but not by jumping there immediately. This is what we were talking about. Yes, perhaps this position is still winning for white, but trying to avoid this tempting feeling of wanting to exploit a weak square immediately. A positional advantage is a long-term advantage. You don't need to do anything immediately. You can prepare this knight jump. Imagine there was no bishop that could actually kill your knight on f5. You want this knight on f5 without being eliminated. The knight would love to stay on f5, so why shall we trade? As many of you have suggested, it would be a great idea to exchange this d7 bishop first. And once we get rid of that bishop, we can jump to f5 and we will be just having a hell of a position. Knight on f5 with a horrible bishop on g7, because let's remember that black's bishop is not getting any better. It is a really passive, a really bad piece. So this is a good knight versus a bad bishop. If we take away all the minor pieces in this position but leave the knight on g3 and the bishop on g7 with some heavy pieces, let's say. So you don't have to think about an endgame, but keep it a middle game. Take away all the minor pieces from white but the g3 knight. Take away all the black minor pieces but the g7 bishop. That is a completely winning position for white because it's a good knight versus bad bishop. So if you understand this concept, you know what pieces you want to trade. And you don't want to jump to f5 now, you want to prepare it. So either we will prepare it by exchanging this d7 bishop if we have a chance. And if we don't have a chance, there's another plan for getting the knight to f5. And that is the way that Kasparov did it in the game that we saw the other session, the other day, which was a knight maneuver. So you need the other knight's support. Now how can this knight support a jump to f5? It takes a couple of moves, and perhaps you don't do it immediately with the king on e1. You don't really want to make moves like knight e1, bishop f2, knight e3, and then you can jump. But this is a plan. Not right now, it's on the long run. So on the long run, you have this knight maneuver, getting your other knight to support the jump to f5. And this can happen in any position. Where you have an outpost for a knight, you should try to eliminate the piece that is defending the square and or get more pieces that can jump or move to the outpost. So this is a general idea that you should remember, not only about the f5 square, but any weak square that you want to exploit. What happened in the game was king f2. of course, as we said, this king is safe on f2. There's just no possibility of opening the f file. So we are safe there. e5, g5 also closed. And after h6, well, black is trying to make sure that there's no h5 to h6 move either. And now this b4 move is really curious. It means that Kasparov is provoking black to actually fix the pawn structure on the queen side. Now, why does he want to do that? He wants to do that because he already has this beautiful outpost on f5, so he doesn't really mind a closed position on the queen side. He has the c file, so it's not like it's totally closed. He has an open file and he has the f5 outpost. Now let's see how he takes advantage of all that. Rook coming to the open file, always a great idea. Doubling rooks on the open file, even better idea. And now that we have placed our king in a safe spot, we have double rooks on the open file. Now there is a moment. This is the moment when you should start maneuvering your pieces. So when all the pieces are developed, your king is safe, that's when you can take these long maneuvers that take ages to complete but are very useful. Knight d1, heading to e3. You will have to move the king away, then the bishop away, and then the knight can jump to e3, and then you can jump to f5. So it takes like 5 moves, but it is worth it, and you have time for this because it's a closed position. Remember, all these maneuvers are possible in closed position. If it's a dynamic position with lots of captures, you don't have time for these kind of moves. Rook c8, king g2, and now bishop f2. There we go, knight e3, next move. Rook c7, and he jumped there. It actually doesn't matter that much which knight. It only matters because of the bishop. So he jumps with this knight because he wants to open the diagonal of this bishop. You shouldn't count on the opponent capturing it. I mean, he might capture it, he might not. But just in case he doesn't, and you want this diagonal for the bishop, jump there with the other knight. Knight e to f5. Rook takes c2 was played, and after rook takes c2, king f7, queen e2, just putting pressure on the b5 pawn. That's a weakness that you can target. So even if you can't capture it immediately, it means that the black queen is tied down to the defense of this pawn and also the bishop on d7. Really sad position where black can barely do anything, so he couldn't exchange pieces on the c file because he needs the queen on b8 and the bishop on d7. He played bishop e8, but as I said, the main problems, this is the main problem. This is a horrible piece. Also, this f8 knight is not doing much, neither the e8 bishop, right? And the a6 knight. So basically all the minor pieces would love to be in a better spot than where they are. All the black pieces are suffering. Queen e3 was played, and after knight d7, rook c6. I don't ask these moves from you because I'm sure that you would play these moves yourself. Rook on the third rank, and now this d6 pawn will fall. So the knight is hanging, the pawn is hanging. This is just a really sad position. Here there are many good moves in this position. Which one would you pick? I mean, you can take on d6 with the knight, you can take with the rook, you can take on g7. Now maybe I should ask it from a different way. Yeah, okay, let's discuss which one would you pick, and then I tell you which one Kasparov picked. Many moves are good. You can also exchange queens with queen a7. Which one do you like the most, personally? Which one would you play in a game? And then, how would you follow? Of course, I'm not asking one move only. Good job, everybody. Of course, as I said, most of the moves are winning in this position. Knight takes d6 is perhaps the strongest. And another very strong move is queen a7. As surprising as it may seem, it's not only about giving mate in this position, but also the endgames are extremely good for you, because after the exchange of the queens, this knight is hanging on c7. He doesn't have a good square, so if you have to play knight a8, we are talking about good knights, but also I should mention bad knights. Bad knight, bad bishop. Two minor pieces are perhaps at the worst possible square. This bishop could be on aj too, but it doesn't really matter. It cannot move from h8, it cannot move from g7. It's equally bad. The knight on a8 is paralyzed. Horrible position for black, material balance, but remember that black would prefer to be a pawn or two down in this position if he could active pieces. So active pieces can compensate for having material down. But when you have such bad pieces as this bishop on g7 and the knight on a8, it loses the game for you. Just simply, this is a fact. Those two pieces are as if they did not exist. It literally is that cruel that those pieces make you lose the game because they barely exist. They are not useful pieces. So this position, you will take this pawn. You will also take this pawn if you like. You can do anything in this position. The other knight can jump to f5, so white's pieces are dominating their position. That's why this endgame is so powerful, so much winning. This is almost like giving mate, because black is playing with basically a virtual two-piece down, plus the real 2-3 pawns down that he will have after, let's say, either the bishop takes a4, knight jumping to f5. This is a position where black can resign. I don't recommend you to resign. Remember the lesson about always fighting, so you can check that on YouTube if you missed that. But what I mean that objectively this position is lost. Never give up. Of course, if you are black here, you should fight and you should find the trick somehow. Anyway, what Kasparov did was none of these moves, and that's why I wanted you to stop for a moment. And if you would have played the move he did, I was a bit surprised. This is a winning move too. There's just no way that it's not winning. But giving up your beautiful monster knight for this horrible bishop, I was a bit surprised. But it's winning because the other knight comes. So in a way, it's true that in this position, the least useful piece of white is the g3 knight. Because all that it does is supporting the other knight. You cannot, you could move away before you needed it. Before there was a bishop on d7 that could capture on f5. That's why you have two knights jumping to f5, two knights supporting this square. But now this g3 knight is not useful anymore, and that's why he took, so that he could make use of all his pieces. The g3 knight is not doing anything. But still, it feels like taking the worst piece of your opponent. Anyway, this is of course not a criticism. Kasparov is winning this game in 3 moves, so this is completely winning, of course. I'm just saying, in an ideal world, you would never take a bad piece. Of course, in the real world, we do this because it's concrete. He's winning. After rook takes d6, this is just winning. It doesn't matter what black does. He will lose something. Actually, black lost the game immediately after knight f8, just giving up the f6 pawn, and then the h6 pawn, and it's just all bad, and then queen takes g5. So this clearly justifies knight takes g7. Maybe he could have done something else. Let's say, I don't know, bishop f7. But this position, it doesn't really matter what move you play. This is winning because your pieces are a lot better and you are a pawn up. You have a passed pawn, protected passed pawn on d5, so any move is good. I don't know, maybe queen e2, putting once again pressure on this pawn, opening the diagonal for the bishop. Any move, you can come with the queen to the c file, then here. It's not winning on the spot, but it's winning. This is a winning position. So all the white pieces are great. Now there's no useless knight on g3. All the white pieces are doing something and are very active, and the black pieces are suffering. So yeah, it's true that the opponent could have fought somewhat better than giving up all his pawns, but he must have blundered this rook takes f6. Anyway, the point was not this. Any move was winning in the end of the game. The point was that after g5 we had this square on f5, and jumping there immediately wouldn't have actually achieved much for white. So whenever you have a square such as the f5 square here, a hole in the opponent's pawn structure, take advantage of it, but you should prepare for getting something out of this weakness. You should either exchange the piece or the pieces that are protecting the square, and or you should maneuver more pieces, like in this game it was knight d1, bishop f2, knight e3, and then jumping to f5. One more game we will see about the knight on f5, and that, as I said, is a game by Vishy Anand. This one he played not in a simul but against a very strong player, Spanish Grandmaster, Spanish #1, Paco Vallejo. You must know him. He has also many videos on Chess24, mainly in Spanish, but I think also a few in English. So you should definitely check out his videos. I was one of the lucky ones to collaborate with him in one of his video series in Spanish. You can check that out as well. But we are not here to talk about Paco. We are here to talk about Vishy, how he played this game in 2014 at the Grand Slam in Bilbao, if I remember correctly, but I don't have it written there. I just see the names. So I believe, okay, I'm almost sure that I took the game from 2014. We don't care much about the opening. This was a Queen's Gambit accepted. I read Vishy's notes on this game, and I know that he was not prepared for this opening. He thought, I mean, of course he knows this opening, but he didn't expect it from Paco, so he was slightly surprised by Black's opening choice, but it didn't mean that he would not know how to respond to this. And we will reach a middle game position where, after rook fd1 and rook a c8, he goes g3. This move, why do you think this move was necessary? I mean, would you play g3 yourself here? What's the point of g3? What's the idea behind this move? Let's just quickly think about this position for a moment. You guys are amazing. Let me just quote some of the opinions here in the chat. For instance, I see Don Williams saying knight g6 is kinda dead right now. It's true that this g3 move is against the knight jump to f4, so Sir Toby is saying prevents black playing knight f4. Pebble Panda saying that king g2, rook h1 and attack. Well, it could be, but mainly the idea is to stop knight f4. You also pointed that out. Francisco Otero Ibarra saying stop knight f4. A second best move is also saying a bad knight on g6 followed with h4, h5. It's a possible follow-up, of course. And what you pointed out, all of you, that it stops knight f4. And after that, another important thing you also said, and I have already read it out, that the g6 knight is now kind of pointless. If you cannot jump to f4, then why do you have the knight on g6? It's not doing anything. It cannot go to h4 and it cannot go to f4. It doesn't do much about protecting the e5 pawn because it's not hanging. It could go to e7 at some point, but that means going backwards. So this move the push g3 prevents knight f4 and makes sure that this g6 knight will not be happy at all. And why I'm talking about this in a session that's about good knights, I'm talking about this because if you remember that today we are focusing on the knight on f5, for black it means a knight on f4. So yes, it's beautiful to have a knight on f5 or on f4, but you don't always get that. And here, since black was trying to place his knight on f4, and after g3 he couldn't, he ended up having a useless knight on g6. So yes, it's beautiful to do that if you can, but it doesn't always work. It doesn't always work out for the player that aims for this. Of course, this is not the case where, imagine, the white pawn was on g4. It's a horrible move in this position. And yes, that would mean the same way that we were talking about this square all the time, that it's a real weakness, it's a real hole in the pawn structure, and black can take advantage of it by jumping there with his knight or preparing this jump. But sometimes, especially when the king is castled on the king side, placing the knight on f4 or on f5 can also work without the pawn, the g pawn, being pushed. And this is what will happen in this game. This was a spoiler. So g3 prevents knight f4, the g6 knight will be a useless piece. Not as bad as the g7 bishop in the previous game, but it's not a very active piece either. So it's a very good move. White could have played it before too if he wanted, but knight f4 was not a huge threat. So even if black jumped to f4 and moved earlier, after queen e3, we are threatening g3. So it wasn't really good to jump there anyway. So this is the position in the game. h6 is a move that Vichy said that he didn't like for black, but it's not so easy to play this position, I think. So not easy. And of course, yeah, you guys said that in the chat that Vichy also has videos on Chess24, and obviously I should have mentioned that too. I only mentioned Paco because I was collaborating with him, so I was actually recording videos with him, so I have a personal experience recording with the Spanish #1, but I did not have a chance to record with Vichy yet. Unfortunately, I did, of course, have the lucky opportunity of interviewing him and also having him in the commentary with Jan Gustafsson, where we were commentating on the Grand Chess Tour in Belgium, in Leuven. I hope to have the same luck this year as well, that I can meet these people in person. Of course, it's great to talk to them, but I did not record a video with Vichy. That's what I was saying. c6, yes, he wants to open the c file, but I think Vichy also did not like this for black. It's just difficult to find a good plan for black. Basically, Paco was suffering in this position. After knight c4 takes, knight takes, you see that there's a knight on d5, but only for a moment. After rook takes though, he keeps the square for the rook. We are not talking about the d5 square today, but it's good to have the rook there if you can, because like this you can double on the d file. You are also putting pressure on the e5 pawn. So it's a useful piece. And now after rook cd1, let's just think, what would you do if black played b5? How do you respond to this? You know the topic of today, so that might help. That might help in figuring out what's the best move here. How to respond, not just one move, but the follow-up. What is the idea? How do you want to play here with the white pieces? Have I ever said that you guys are brilliant? Because it's true. Once again, you guessed it. Basically, all of you, I can read out the ones I see right now. Blitzenem is saying the bishop to capture the bishop and the knight to e3. Also, second best move saying swap the bishops to reroute the knight to f5. Pebble Panda, bishop takes c5, then knight e3, knight f5. Blitzenemi to go to f5. But once again, it was a correction from his previous answer. Odell Checkham Jr., bishop takes c5, knight e3. Isurox, bishop takes c5, knight e3. Shach Pirate, bishop takes c5, knight e3, knight f5. And I could go on. Jerry Baldy and all of you, Sir Toby. Thank you guys for being so great. I'm so proud of you. I think that these sessions make sense because you guys, I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like you guys are improving. So let me know in the chat if you think that these middle game sessions are actually improving your strategy skills. I think they do. This is what I see from the chat. I see that you guys are getting all these maneuvers right, so I'm proud of you. Bishop takes c5 was played. Of course, as you guys suggested. So you play like Vishen and be proud of it. Bishop takes c5, so that next move you can go to e3 with the knight. So this is a cute intermediate move necessary in order to bring the knight to e3. And either knight e3 now or after capturing on c5, the same idea. So you can take or you can go knight e3 immediately, depending on your taste. And then the idea is, of course, jumping to f5 with the knight. You can also jump to d5, I drew it, but here I would mainly route for knight f5 because you want to attack the black king. It's funny because there are not many pieces on the board, but the pieces that are left for white can be extremely dangerous. A knight on f5, a queen on g4, and you have the open d file. Then you can push h4, h5, and it's mate on g7. You might think that's too much, it's not possible, it's not so easy to prevent it, and you will see it in the game that this idea, as simple as it sounds, works. So a knight on f5, queen on g4, and push the h-pawn. Let's go back to the game. So instead of b5, Paco took on e3 immediately. Knight takes, of course, I will not even ask it. You know that this is the idea. And yeah, this is basically what we have already said. The knight will go to f5. You have the d5 for the rook, so it's as usual double rooks on the open file. Queen to g4 and push the h-pawn. Already announced. Let's just see how it works out move by move in the game, because this is the plan, but you should always pay attention to the opponent's threats. So after queen b4, yes, the pawn is hanging on e4. Luckily, the jump knight f5 protects the pawn as well, so we should definitely play knight f5. And now after rook c4, knight d6 was played because this pawn is hanging on e4. So yes, our plan is to play h4, h5 and queen g4 or queen g4, h4, h5, but you should always address what the opponent wants. And after rook c4, you cannot just go h4. You have to do something about the e4 pawn. You can play either a3 and calculate what happens there. We will not go into that because Vichy played knight d6, and I think that's much better. You don't have any complications. Knight d6 attacks the rook, protects the pawn. So he chases away the rook. He chases away the queen in order to chase away the queen even more, in order to jump back to f5. So it's just a funny detail that we got to f5 with the knight, but temporarily he had to abandon this f5 square. So he does this in order to protect the e4 pawn. Then he makes sure that those heavy pieces, the most active pieces of black, should be going backwards instead of attacking white's camp. So he forces the rook back, he forces the queen back, and then he jumps back to f5. This is mastery. So yes, he achieved that. Black's pieces are not attacking. His knight is on f5, and next move could be h4, h5 or queen g4. Rook e8. Now this is a moment once again to stop and think, because we want to play h4, h5 and queen g4, but what does the opponent want? What's the point of rook e8? What do you think he wants? And what can you do about it? Let's see if you spot it. What does black want after rook e8? I told you, you guys are great. Once again, you spotted what black wanted, and I don't think that I was helping much, so blame only yourself for the correct solution. Black wants knight e7. When the opponent has a monster piece, like what white has now on f5, as black, you should aim for eliminating that piece. So you should either try to chase it away, but in this position, I mean, you can't attack the f5 knight with the g pawn. So if you can't attack it, then eliminate it. Knight e7 is actually a big threat positionally because the f5 knight is our treasure. We will love that knight on f5, so we don't want to allow knight e7, and a simple way to prevent knight e7 is a very strong move that you guys have suggested, and it's of course rook d7. The rook loves the 7th rank, the second 7th rank, depending on the point of view, prevents knight e7 at the same time, so it's a great move. Rook f6. Well, does he threaten something immediately? We should always ask it after each and every move of the opponent, but once you realize that rook f6 is not doing much, at least not threatening our pieces, you can carry out your plan. So either h4 or queen g4. Now queen c6, is he threatening something? We should always answer that question. No, queen c6 is no big deal. The pawn is defended on e4, the rook is not hanging on d7, there are no tricks related to this d7 rook. Black is simply trying to do something, but his position is so sad. It's sad because he cannot move away this knight. That would be mate on g7. He was trying to protect this f7 pawn, that's why he goes rook f6, and you're trying to bring more pieces to the king side. But it's just sad. His pieces are passive. And even if it looks like black has all the pieces, bringing all his pieces to the help of the black king, he will fail to defend everything, and you will see why. So these moves, Paco was just trying, but this position is lost, so it doesn't really matter what he plays. You can analyze this position if you want to see other variations. I always say I'm not showing you the complete game in terms of analyzing every possible option for, let's say, this position. If you want to know more about this position, you can check this game, find it in the database on Chess24, Anand versus Vallejo from 2014, the Grand Slam in Bilbao. And then you can really analyze any line that you think that, oh, why not this, why not that? Instead of doing that, we want to learn the ideas. We are learning today about the f5 knight, how useful this can be. Remember that white got his knight to f5 and black didn't. So black was aiming for a knight on f4 and he didn't. He could not carry that plan out. White managed, and now he is winning because all his pieces are active and he is just pushing h4, threatening h5, and this is a deadly threat. You cannot do anything. You would need 2 tempi to get your queen to f8 to protect the g7 square, and even then I believe it would be lost, but you don't even have time for that. So this is bad. Paco had to play h5, sacrificing this pawn for the e-pawn, so that's why he played queen c6, at least getting this e-pawn. But it's going to be as bad as before. He has a trick in this position, though, and Vichy calculated it. He played rook d8, that's the correct move. The trick was that knight d6 looks like a winning move. You are winning the rook on e8. But after queen c2, knight takes, and rook takes f2. Vichy correctly evaluated that this position with a rook down for black is actually winning for black. I mean, this sounds crazy. He's a rook down, but he's threatening all sorts of stuffs on the second rank, basically meaning mate on the second rank, and you can barely prevent it. I mean, not barely, you cannot prevent it. You have to prevent it by sacrificing your rook, so you have to give back the rook in order to survive, and that means a pawn up for black, and finally it's him who has active pieces. Look at your knight on e8. That's not the good knight we are talking about. But the point is that, as I said, even when you are winning, just you should be so careful after each and every move of the opponent. Don't be overconfident. I lost several games because of thinking that I was already winning. And when you think that it's already winning and you are just waiting for the opponent to shake hands and sign the score sheet, that's when you can make mistakes. That's when you are careless, and that's when you are not objective. Don't do that. In every position, no matter how winning your position is, you want to make the best move. You don't care if it's a rook up for you, a queen up for you, but make the best move. And always ask what is the opponent threatening with. So knight d6 would have been a bad move, completely underestimating the attack that black has here against the white king. Don't do this. Don't fall into traps. So rook d8 is a great move, trying to go for a back rank mate after capturing, and knight e7, that's a mate of course, so queen c6 is forced. You have to bring back the queen. Now after queen g5, once again we are threatening h5. This is horrible, isn't that? Queen e6 was played, and now the knight is hanging on f5, so we don't have time for h5, but there's a winning move here. You can try to find it. Of course, this session is not about whether you can calculate this or not. You have already succeeded in answering all the questions that were about strategy and about maneuvers. So this is just the final question that Miss Tactics will ask you. Your knight is hanging on f5, and you cannot push h5 because your knight will be captured. But you have a very strong move here, winning material. So how to win material here as white, and see which pieces are hanging or could be hanging for black. Let's see who can find that. You guys have officially passed the test, not only of Miss Strategy, but also of Miss Tactics, so she will be proud of you guys as well. Rook 1 to d6, many of you have suggested this move, and that's the winning move. After rook to d6, from the first rank to d6, there's no way to prevent the material loss for black. The e8 rook is the piece that is hanging, could be hanging, so whenever you see a piece that's protected, well, it could either be a piece that's completely undefended but not attacked, or a piece that is attacked and protected with just one piece, or you attack a piece with two pieces, then two. I mean, it's confusing the way I'm explaining it, I know. But the point is that whenever you see something like this, rook is attacking the rook, queen is protecting the rook. So you know that this queen cannot abandon the rook, and that creates tactical motives. So this queen, after rook d6, just fails to keep on protecting the rook, and black has no time to capture here because this is the queen that's hanging. Also, I mean, no, rook takes d8 is better in this position. Excuse me, I was so happy about taking the queen, but it's better to give mate sometimes. Always better to give mate. So don't listen to me. Rook takes e6 is winning, but rook d8 is even more winning. Any move is winning here, doesn't matter what black does. Of course, if he captures the knight, we just take the rook, and it's completely winning. I think this is where Paco resigned, actually. No, after rook 1 to d6 he resigned. Doesn't matter what he does. If queen takes d6, you can even take the rook first and then the knight. It's just painful. There's no move for black. Let's say rook takes f5, then we take, now we take the queen, then we take the rook, and then we will take the other rook. So imagine this position. You can win all the rooks of the opponent. That next move, take this one. horrible. After rook d6, it resigned. That's what Paco did. I hope that you enjoyed this game. The point was not only whether you can see this final tactical motive, but I'm proud of you. I'm proud of you that you did. But about the f5 knight, and it all started from a relatively balanced position. So I mean, yes, this opening is perhaps not the most traditional. Perhaps you don't play this with any colors, but this knight on f6 and knight on g6 happens often in the Italian, in the Spanish, and also plenty of other openings that right now I can't name, but mainly e4, e5 openings. I'm sure that some of you who play e4, e5 openings have definitely seen this a couple of times, and also if you follow the games of Super Grandmasters, they almost always have knight on f3, g3, and knight on f6, g6. This is such a traditional maneuver in the Italian and in the Spanish opening. So you know now that it's often a good idea to try to place a knight on f4 or on f5, but it doesn't always work out. Sometimes g3 will prevent it, and if he prevents it, without, of course, weakening something that he doesn't want. Here, the good thing about this position is that there's no light squared bishop. Imagine black had a bishop on c8 and, I don't know, our rook was on f1, anything. So what I'm trying to say is that g3 of course weakens the light squares in your position, and if there was a bishop and if you could bring the queen as black to the king side, so there are positions when g3 is not good because it will just weaken too much the light squares. But here, without a light squared bishop, it's completely safe to play g3. And then a couple of moves later, white was heading to f5 himself, and that could not be prevented because the g6 knight was there. Imagine this knight was on f6 and not on g6. First of all, he could capture our rook. Secondly, if we don't blunder our rook, he could play g6 and prevent knight f5. So unfortunately, sometimes this knight on g6, about g6 or g3, about to jump to f5, it can be good, it also can be bad, depending on the position. It's always about the position. So in this position, the g6 knight was actually preventing black from preventing the knight jump to f5. This was what happened later, and then just a few more precise moves, not allowing black to have any counterplay, preventing knight e7. Remember that when you have a monster piece, the opponent will want to eliminate that piece, so prevent it, prevent all sorts of trades like knight e7, and then you can continue with your plan, h4, h5, and it's just such a powerful piece. The knight on f5 most of the times it's connected to ideas with a kingside attack, attacking the black king, because often your opponent will castle kingside, and if you have your knight on f5, you are attacking the g7 square, which is right next to the king. Very logical that this knight is therefore connected to kingside attack. With a queen on the g5, or imagine a rook coming to the g5, you will always try to attack this g7 pawn, or a bishop sacrifice on h6. There are many ideas connected to a knight on f5. You can look up more games, try to find more games with the knight on f5, and let me know which games you like the most with the knight on f5, a good knight on f5. And just in general, remember that as in the previous game, the Kasparov game, whenever there's a weak square, you want to jump there, but it's not urgent. So in this case, it was not urgent because this is a hole. The f5 square in this game was a hole, and you can maneuver there. It can take 10 moves, and it's still good that you jump there with the knight. The position is closed. Now the Vichy game is different. Here you don't have all the time in the world, because that means that black could place his knight on e7, exchange your knight, not here, but I mean, imagine you take ages. You play moves like king g2, rook d2, you start making slow moves, and you end up with the opponent creating the option of eliminating your knight. So here, the f5 square is not a hole, it's an outpost, because it's great to have the knight there, but it's not forever. If black has time, he will manage to move away his knight protect the h6 pawn and push g6 and chase you away. So a knight like this is not forever, that's why you should be very precise, you should act immediately. Rook d7 was therefore a very important move, preventing knight e7. I hope that you like these games, and as I said, let me know if you know other games with the knight on f5 or with the knight on d5. And next week, not on Thursday, but on Tuesday for next week, there will be a change only for that week. Next week it's on Tuesday when we have a Miss Strategies middle game show. We will practice everything that we learned today and in the previous session. So a knight on d5 or a knight on f5. We will play a thematic tournament with one of these themes. So make sure that you check the model games that we have practiced, and a knight on d5 or knight on f5 will be what you will be playing against fellow Chess24 members, and we will be practicing everything that we have learned. Hope you will join me next Tuesday and have a lovely weekend. See you next time.